He would fly into LZ X-ray 20 two times. You can feel something is wrong with the aircraft before any gauge on the instrument panel confirms it. The flight controls react differently. In the skies of Vietnam in 1965, when an airframe suddenly feels wrong, it means enemy fire has punched through something critical. Below his skids lies 100 meters of trampled grass at the base of the Chu Pong Massif in the Drang Valley. Roughly 450 American infantrymen are pinned down inside that perimeter, with somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 North Vietnamese regulars working to eliminate them. The radio speaker outputs a sound that stays with you forever. Men pleading for casualty evacuation, only to be told that medevac flights are not coming. His Huey carried no armor. Medical rescue was never his assignment. The soldiers dying in the dirt below were technically not his problem. This is what Major Bruce Crandall chose to do about it. Bruce Perry Crandall was born February 17, 1933, in Olympia, Washington.
He grew up playing baseball, earned high school All-American honors, and attended college, hoping the New York Yankees would draft him. The United States Army drafted him instead in 1953. He reported for duty intending to serve 2 years and return to the outfield, but 2 years turned into a lifelong career. The military commissioned him as an engineer officer before making him a pilot. He flew mapping missions over the Sahara Desert, executed reconnaissance sorties across Central and South America, and spent time at Fort Benning with the 11th Air Assault Division, helping shape the air-mobile tactics that would define the 1st Cavalry Division. By the time the Vietnam War escalated, Crandall had logged 12 years of flight time across 3 continents in environmental conditions that killed aviators who made miscalculations. His call sign was Ancient Serpent 6, but the men under his command called him Snake. He arrived in Vietnam commanding Company A of the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion, 1st Cavalry Division, based at Camp Radcliffe near An Khe, equipped with 16 UH-1 Hueys.
On the morning of November 14, 1965, he received an operational directive: transport the men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment from Plei Me into Landing Zone X-ray in the Drang Valley. The operation rapidly degraded. On the 4th wave of troop insertions, enemy ground fire erupted. Crandall's pilots pushed through the barrage and delivered their infantrymen. On the 5th wave, as the lead 8 helicopters touched down at LZ X-ray to unload soldiers, the volume of incoming fire became so intense that Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, the ground commander, ordered the 2nd flight of 8 aircraft to abort their landing. They turned back immediately. Crandall's 8 Hueys touched down inside what had become an active kill zone, unloaded their troops, and extracted. On the flight back to base, Crandall listened to the radio traffic the entire way. What he heard was a tactical situation going disastrously wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Moore's troopers were attempting to hold off 2 full North Vietnamese regiments descending from the Chu Pong Massif.
Casualties were mounting, and ammunition supplies were rapidly depleting. The designated medevac helicopters took one look at LZ X-ray and decided the landing zone was far too dangerous. Their operating rules demanded a green LZ, meaning 0 incoming fire for 5 consecutive minutes. LZ X-ray had not been green since the 4th wave, and it would not see a green status for days. The wounded were stacking up along the perimeter. Crandall touched down back at Plei Me, called his aircraft commanders together, and laid out his plan. He was going back in. He wasn't bringing in troop reinforcements because the landing zone couldn't process an assault load under that volume of fire. He was going to fly in small arms ammunition and haul out the wounded, executing the exact task the medevac in it refused to perform. He asked for volunteers. Imagine standing on the airstrip at Plei Me, listening to the chaotic chatter over the radio, while the officer who just brought you out of LZ X-ray asks if you will fly back into it. He isn't ordering you. He is asking.
To cut weight and carry more casualties, he stripped his Hueys of their door gunners and M60 machine guns. He had already calculated that if an infantryman was going to die in LZ X-ray, an M60 mounted in a helicopter door wasn't going to turn the tide of the firefight. The soldiers holding the ground perimeter owned the firefight. What they desperately required was ammunition and immediate extraction. He could supply both if he stripped the airframe down to bare metal. Captain Ed Freeman, Crandall's wingman and former superior officer, stepped forward immediately. Back in Panama, Freeman had outranked Crandall, but promotions had moved differently over the years. Now Crandall commanded the unit, and Freeman volunteered to follow him back into a location both men knew was a shooting gallery. They lifted off. That was the flight distance from the staging area at Plei Me to LZ X-ray. Calculating 2.5 minutes each way, plus brief seconds on the dirt, a full round trip took roughly 7 to 8 minutes.
Executing 22 round trips across 16 continuous hours amounted to near constant flight under hostile fire. Crandall and Freeman guided their unarmed Hueys into the clearing, dropped crates of ammunition, loaded bleeding casualties onto bare cabin floors with the seats removed, and pulled out. They timed their approaches around friendly artillery barrages, the only asset keeping enemy forces from swarming the perimeter. When the artillery fired, Crandall held his orbit. The moment the guns paused, he dropped into the zone. He flew his primary aircraft 3 times until battle damage made it structurally unsafe to keep in the air. He picked up other available Hueys throughout the day, some with fresh bullet holes covered in duct tape, so maintenance crews knew where to inspect for new damage after every run. He flew airframes that should have been grounded. He flew aircraft shot through the tail rotor housing, through the fuel bladders, and straight through the instrument panel.
12 years of mapping deserts and flying through jungle environments where a single mistake meant smashing into the terrain had given Crandall a precise understanding of what a helicopter could endure. He knew what he was flying and what the machine could take. He also recognized that the troopers on the ground at LZ X-ray had no such technical calculations available to them. They were stuck on the ground with whatever ammunition remained. The aircraft that arrived gave them a fighting chance. The aircraft that turned away sealed their fate. After almost every flight, his crew used buckets of water to wash blood off the cabin deck plates. The crew chief on one of his aircraft was shot through the throat. 3 crew members aboard his helicopters were killed that day, and 3 more were wounded. 6 members of his flight crews were knocked out of action by enemy fire in a single 16-hour shift. He kept flying.
By the time darkness fell over the Drang Valley, Crandall and Freeman had executed 12 separate missions after the assigned medevac unit issued its final refusal to fly into the zone. 12 flights into a landing area that a dedicated medical evacuation organization had officially ruled too hazardous for their crews. That was when the flashlight request came over the radio net. The battle had raged for more than 12 hours. Moore's battalion had held the line, preventing the enemy from penetrating the perimeter, but the human cost continued to accumulate as wounded men needed extraction. The medevac unit had established its position hours earlier and refused to alter it. Every mission Crandall and Freeman flew after that refusal was entirely unauthorized by any chain of command outside their own judgment. Nadal, the company commander, requesting casualty extraction from a pickup point on the edge of the line, described his situation over the radio. 3 sides of his position were enclosed by dense trees, and medevac pilots had previously declined to land there, claiming the canopy made any low approach impossible. Crandall listened to the description and decided he would drop in vertically, straight down through the gap in the trees, in total darkness without landing lights. He instructed Nadal to point a single flashlight vertically into the night sky from the center of the touchdown spot. That was his entire guidance system, a single beam of light piercing the dark. Crandall flew completely blacked out, with no position lights and no searchlights, dropping into a gap in the trees, surrounded by enemy troops, guided by a beam held by a man on the ground, who was actively taking fire. He set his skids down, loaded 12 wounded soldiers, and pulled out vertically. He executed the exact same maneuver a second time. Both Hueys were barely airworthy when they finally returned to base at 10:30 that night. The duty day had begun at 6 in the morning. In between, 22 combat sorties, 75 casualties evacuated to field hospitals, and critical ammunition delivered to men who would have been overrun without it. Crandall later described it as the longest day he had ever spent inside an aircraft cockpit. The official citation required 41 years to be written into history. While medical evacuation was not his mission, he immediately sought volunteers and with complete disregard for his own personal safety. That is the exact phrasing the Medal of Honor citation utilized to describe what Bruce Crandall accomplished on November 14, 1965. That single sentence took 4 decades to move through military administrative channels. When the battle ended, Crandall and Freeman were both awarded the Distinguished Service Cross alongside the Distinguished Flying Cross. Both were significant combat decorations, but neither represented the nation's highest honor.
Hal Moore firmly believed both aviators deserved the Medal of Honor and submitted formal recommendations. The paperwork traveled through channels that moved at a crawl. Freeman received his Medal of Honor first. Edward Too Tall Freeman had been rejected by military flight screeners early in his career because his 6'4" frame was considered too large for standard cockpit dimensions. He found a workaround, earned his wings, served in Panama as Crandall's superior, and then watched as his former subordinate was promoted past him. He served under the man he used to command without an ounce of friction or resentment. Nobody in Crandall's subunit ever realized Freeman had once outranked their commander. At LZ X-ray, Freeman volunteered to fly into a kill zone alongside the officer who now led him.
He spent the day flying next to Crandall into the same fire, making the same approaches in the same unarmored aircraft. When Crandall asked who would go in, Freeman didn't wait for anyone else to answer. President George W. Bush presented Freeman with the Medal of Honor on July 16, 2001. Freeman passed away on August 20, 2008, at age 74. Crandall waited 6 additional years after Freeman's White House ceremony. The original recommendation had been submitted by Hal Moore within days of the battle, but it drifted through administrative channels that delayed action, demanded additional documentation, and required endless reviews. Crandall had already received the Distinguished Service Cross, and several officials in the chain of command appeared to conclude that the DSC was sufficient recognition. Others strongly disagreed. The argument dragged on across 4 decades. A 41-year delay is not a mere administrative oversight. It is a decision made by bureaucrats evaluating paperwork for a Distinguished Service Cross while sitting far from the battlefield. They were not at LZ X-ray on November 14, 1965. They did not experience what 22 combat sorties and 16 hours inside an active kill zone looks like from the cockpit. He went back anyway, 22 times. Every decision made in the exact same valley, inside the same aircraft, diving into the same fire, with full awareness of what had happened to the airframes flying ahead of him. 2 months later, on January 31, 1966, Crandall had just completed a long day supporting Operation Masher when word came that an infantry company was pinned down with 12 casualties requiring instant evacuation. He refueled his Huey and lifted off. The unit commander pinned down in that engagement was Nadal, the same company commander whose flashlight beam had guided him through the trees at LZ X-ray. They worked together once again, and the wounded were successfully extracted. Crandall completed his first combat tour with over 900 combat missions recorded in his logbook, then volunteered to go back. Some men who survived what Crandall endured at Ia Drang treated their survival as a reason never to take such extreme risks again. Crandall returned to Vietnam for a second tour of duty, flying UH-1 Huey gunships in support of the 1st Battalion, 9th Cavalry Squadron. In January 1968, 4 months into his second deployment, his gunship was brought down by friendly fire when Air Force bomb detonations occurred too close to his flight path. He was medevaced out with a broken back and shrapnel injuries, spending the next 5 months recovering in a hospital ward. If you forged your skills flying unarmored resupply missions into a kill zone in 1965, survived those extreme odds, and returned for a second tour in heavy gunships, you held a specific understanding of what combat odds meant and what you owed the men on the ground. You accepted the mathematical reality and kept flying until the odds caught up with you. January 1968 was when the math caught up with Bruce Crandall. The war was finished with him.
He enrolled at the University of Nebraska, graduated in 1969, and spent the following decades managing massive public infrastructure projects, directing facility engineering in Bangkok, managing 3,800 workers, overseeing public works in Mesa, Arizona, and serving as city manager in Dunsmuir, California. He was inducted into the Army Aviation Hall of Fame in 2004. He granted interviews, visited schools, attended 1st Cavalry Division reunions, and stood in rooms filled with men whose lives existed solely because of decisions he made on a November morning in 1965. None of those post-war achievements were what people ever asked him about. On February 26, 2007, inside the East Room of the White House, President George W. Bush looped the Medal of Honor around the neck of retired Lieutenant Colonel Bruce P. Crandall, more than 41 years after November 14, 1965. Crandall's wife, Arlene, stood in the room.
The citation was read into the official record. Major Crandall's bravery and daring courage to land under the most extreme hostile fire instilled in the ground forces the realization that friendly wounded would be promptly evacuated. Afterward, Crandall delivered a remark that carried the exact same unvarnished reality as his actions at LZ X-ray. "I'm still here. Most of these awards are posthumous, so I can't complain." He meant it literally. He had made 22 approaches into an active kill zone across 16 hours of continuous flight operations. He had watched aircraft return riddled with bullet holes and flown them straight back into combat with duct tape covering fresh damage. He had washed blood off his cabin floorboards. He had buried 3 of his crew members and sent 3 more to emergency surgery. He had executed all of it without formal orders, without a specific mission assignment, and without any authorization beyond his own personal assessment of what the infantrymen on the ground required. He went back anyway, 22 times. Every single decision made in the exact same valley, inside the same aircraft, diving into the same wall of fire, with complete knowledge of what the airframes flying ahead of him had gone through. He knew the risk, calculated the odds, and flew the mission. Of all the men who earned the Medal of Honor at Ia Drang, most did not survive the battle to receive it. The men he pulled out of LZ X-ray made it possible for him to stand in that White House room at 74 years old and deliver a dry joke about basic survival. 75 of those soldiers came home solely because of what he chose to do on that day. Every time his skids broke contact with the dirt, he knew the odds stacked against him. Every time he banked back toward the landing zone, he ran the exact same mental calculation and arrived at the exact same answer. The evacuation mission wasn't assigned to him. The bleeding casualties were not his technical duty. The risk of death was absolute, and military regulations dictated staying clear.
Bruce Perry Crandall passed away after living a long life, outliving Arlene, who died in 2010, outliving Freeman by 17 years, and outliving most of the infantrymen he evacuated from LZ X-ray on November 14, 1965. The Army's official terminology for his actions describes it as being executed with complete disregard for his own personal safety. 75 men walked back into the world from LZ X-ray because of his choices on November 14, 1965. Every single one of them was loaded onto a cabin floor, still wet with another soldier's blood. He knew the precise odds on every single approach, calculated the risk down to the second, and flew straight into the fire anyway. If you flew in the Drang Valley in 1965, or if your father or grandfather fought on the ground inside LZ X-ray, leave his unit designation and his name in the comments. The men who stood in that dirt deserve to be remembered by name.